Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our March talk, because it is March. It came quickly. Black History Month is over. We had an extra day, so that was good. But today we are joined by one of our 2019-2020 Du Bois postdoctoral fellows, Sarah Holm Tanzi. Received her PhD in political science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she studied economic and political theory. Her dissertation was titled Free Market Authoritarianism and the Election of Donald Trump. Just pause. And it examines how scapegoating narratives are used to blame economic crisis on immigrant and minority populations, and how the right-wing media establishment works to make these narratives salient and influential to voters. So, although her dissertation was in the past, we are faced with an interesting year upon us in 2020. Using a framework of intersectionality and using interdisciplinary methods, including discourse analysis, she researches what type of media narratives are most effective in mobilizing voters and shifting opinions. As a postdoctoral fellow at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center, she conducted archival research to investigate how Du Bois conceived of his role as both an academic and a propagandist, and how empirical research can be coupled with popular media outlets to impact political mobilization and social change. For some, Twitter is how you communicate public policy and everything. And to others, apparently some of us need to catch up.
Yeah.
But this is a very interesting time to hear someone that studies politics, because it is all around us. Super Tuesday is past, but not really, right? So let's welcome Dr. Tanzi to share her wisdom with us.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. All right. So, let's get started. All right. In Dusk of Dawn, Du Bois explains a moment in his past when, started right into it, and I didn't even do all the things I wanted to do. First, I wanted to thank Whitney and Adam and the Du Bois Center for giving me this opportunity to use the archives to conduct this research. It's been incredibly helpful for my project, which, as Whitney pointed out, looks at discourse and scapegoating narratives and media today, but looking back at Du Bois has given me a great historical perspective, and much of this talk will be on Du Bois's shift, why he made that shift, the historical moment in his life when he decided to give up the academy and go towards propaganda and become an editor of The Crisis. And so having that historical perspective through his work has really enriched mine. And I'll be talking more too, I also want to say, about the current events in terms of the media at a seminar tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. It's a lunch seminar. It's in this room. Everybody's invited if you'd like to come and follow up on our discussion. So after thanking the Du Bois Center, I would also like to acknowledge that the land that we are on right now is indigenous land of the Pecumtuck tribe, Pecumtuck territory that we're standing on right now. So I think that needs to be acknowledged and respected, and we're grateful to have this university here. And on that note, I'd also like to point out that this is a public land grant university, and it was designed with the intention of serving the citizens of Massachusetts, particularly lower income citizens of Massachusetts who wanted and desired a higher education and may not have access to it in other places. So Du Bois was a proud supporter of public land grant institutions, and I hope that we all continue to be, and I hope that our administration continues to be and continues to serve the mission of what this school was designed to do. So with that being said, I will start my presentation. This is Du Bois in his office in Atlanta University. In Dusk of Dawn, Du Bois explains a moment in his past when, upon hearing that Sam Hose had killed his landlord, he wrote out a careful reasoned statement concerning the evident facts and started down to the Atlanta Constitution office, seeking publication in the paper. On the way, however, he hears news that Sam Hose has been lynched by a mob of nearly 2,000, and his burnt knuckles were on exhibition in a storefront along the street. At this point, Du Bois explains that he turned back, realizing that this war was not one facts alone can win. He wrote, "I regarded it as axiomatic that the world wanted to learn the truth, and if the truth was sought with even approximate accuracy and painstaking devotion, the world would gladly support the effort. This was, of course, but a young man's idealism, not by any means false, but also never universally true. This, along with many other early incidents that displayed the illogic and brutality of human actions, are what David Levering Lewis describes as the impetus for Du Bois's shift from science to propaganda. I'm interested in Du Bois's reflection that political action is not dictated by the realm of truth alone, but the realm of emotion, not on fact, but on appearance." This presentation will focus on this turn that Du Bois took, examining the moment in his life and the reasons he gave for leaving this ivory tower to become an agitator and a propagandist. In my conclusion, I will tie his thoughts to the current political moment. The 2016 presidential election of Donald Trump was unexpected by most mainstream media, political, and academic analysts, and left many grappling with the reality that facts often don't matter, and that a statement based on truth is not, in itself, politically persuasive. There is a debate among political scientists as to what role the media has in influencing opinion and preference. The standard position is Clapper's minimal effect hypothesis, which claims that the media does little to influence voters. I argue against this hypothesis by examining what types of appeals are being made, concluding that while fact reporting alone may have little influence, emotionally based narratives can be highly influential. While current research relies on empirical studies, Du Bois came to this revelation through his lived experience. As a person in pursuit of racial and economic justice who wanted to effect material change in society, he came to the conclusion that facts alone could not meet these ends. And he turned from being an academic to being a, quote, propagandist for the truth. I begin by looking at this moment where Du Bois leaves Atlanta University to become editor of The Crisis, realizing that although facts may be laudable, they may not change people's opinions. This shift that happened in Du Bois's life is documented in several works, Dusk of Dawn, his autobiography, and in several pieces that I found in my own archival work in the archives, the University of Massachusetts. One essay I found in the archives is entitled My Life from 1959, and it says, for instance, "I took graduate work at Harvard and the University of Berlin studying history and sociology. I returned to the United States and began my life work in 1894 at the age of 26. My life during the next 50 years may be divided roughly into two periods. 25 years of research and teaching in the University of Pennsylvania and Atlanta University in an endeavor to build a scientific foundation for the solution of the Negro problem, and 23 years of propaganda, of writing and lecturing in order to make America realize the facts and act according to that knowledge and accepted moral principles." Another document from these archives, which I also found, was a June 1953 draft that was entitled The Life of W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963. Du Bois again emphasizes this shift in his life, writing, "There opened before me four main lines of work and endeavor, which over the years I followed. First, there was the search for truth, especially as it related to Negro peoples. My idea was that what we called the Negro problem was really a problem of ignorance. That first, we should know the facts concerning race relations, and from that, come to conclusions concerning methods of settling these problems. This marked the second main line of my life work. From the lynching and lawlessness of the South, I had begun to realize that ignorance of the facts was not the sole cause of the Negro problems. that behind this lay ill will and the willingness to gain by the degradation of black workers. I must therefore turn aside, at least temporarily, from study and measurement to agitation and persuasion, to what we now call propaganda, but propaganda based on knowledge of the truth. My emotional nature was thus loosed from its rigorous restraint, and I began to plead for justice. These two quotes describe Du Bois's turn that acts as a pivotal moment in his long life. But as Du Bois was first and foremost a pragmatist committed to seeing social change occur, he would pursue whatever avenue he thought would best bring tangible results. We see that even when he began his scientific career, he did so in the hopes that these investigations could remedy the race problem in the United States. When he first embarked on his studies in Atlanta, him graduating Harvard, academic garb, he explained that at this moment in his life, my vision was becoming clearer. The Negro problem was, in my mind, a matter of systematic investigation and intelligent understanding. The world was thinking wrong about race because it did not know. The ultimate evil was stupidity. The cure for it was knowledge based on scientific investigation. Therefore, Du Bois set out a mammoth undertaking at Atlanta University, what he called an ambitious program for 100 years of study, in which he proposed to, quote, take up annually in each decade the main aspects of the group of the life of Negroes and through a thorough and studied measurement as possible. And Du Bois put out many studies over these 13 years. Although the project did not continue for 100, as he had hoped, the reports that he generated were highly praised and distributed throughout libraries and universities worldwide. He produced some of the most thorough and skilled research on the life of African Americans at the time, and his work was used and cited by scholars nationally and internationally. For 13 years, he produced these studies ranging from a variety of topics, from Negro urbanization to Negro business and banks, to mortality, health, crime, to Negro schools and colleges, and to the Negro church and artisan. And still, all of this study was for Du Bois ultimately about trying to bring about social change. We know that each of his Atlanta University studies began with a preface that stated, "The object of these studies is primarily scientific, a careful search for truth conducted as thoroughly, broadly, and honestly as the material resources and mental equipment at command will allow. But this is not our sole object. We wish not only to make the truth clear, but to present it in such a shape as will encourage and help social reform." At the same time, however, while Du Bois was committing himself to researching the life of African Americans, the cruelty, abuses, and injustices that threatened to make life unlivable for African Americans were steadily increasing. Du Bois found himself deeply conflicted in his role as an academic. He writes, "I tried to isolate myself in the ivory tower of race. I wanted to explain the difficulties of race and the ways in which these difficulties caused political and economic troubles. In these years, I was torn with excitement of quick-moving events. Lynchings, for instance, was still a continuing horror in the United States at the time of my entrance upon a teaching career. It reached a climax in 1892 when 235 persons were publicly murdered, and in the 16 years of my teaching, nearly 2,000 persons were publicly killed by mobs, and not a single one of the murderers punished." The social ills he was hoping to cure around him were steadily increasing. And it is interesting here how he describes himself as isolated in an ivory tower of race. Although his inquiry and research was focused on the problem of race, he still felt himself as removed and detached from the imminent struggle as an academic isolated up in his ivory tower. The tensions he described here grew until 1899. They reached a turning point where these tensions became too great. He writes of this moment, "At the very time when my studies were most successful, there cut across this plan which I had as a scientist a red ray which could not be ignored. I remembered when it first, as it were, startled me to my feet." This was the moment when Sam Hose was lynched on April 24th, 1899. Du Bois was 31 years old. Sam Hose was a 21-year-old African-American man who had grown up on a farm near Macon, Georgia. He had been working as a farmhand for a prominent family in Palmetto, Georgia, a few miles southwest of Atlanta. Hose had gotten into an altercation with his employer over payment of his wages and ended up on the run, being accused of murdering his employer, Alfred Cranford, and then raping his wife, Mattie Cranford. The papers had already begun sensationalizing the crime, calling Hose a monster in human form, a fiend incarnate. A much reprinted account given by the Georgia congressman, James M. Griggs, said that, quote, he crept into their happy little home, and after attacking Alfred Cranford, he snatched the child from its mother, threw it across the room out of the way, and then by force accomplished his foul purpose. He carried her helpless body into another room and there stripped her every person of every thread and vestige of clothing, there keeping her till time enough had elapsed to permit him to accomplish his fiendish offense twice more and again. This sensationalizing roiled the townsfolk into a frenzy, and a lynch mob began hunting for Hose, which was called the largest manhunt in the state's history. Newspapers were already printing the inevitable end would be the death of Hose at the hands of the mob. As early as April 13th, just one day after the crime, the Atlanta Constitution's front page headline read, "Determined mob after Hose. He will be lynched if caught," with a subheading reading, "The assailants of Mrs. Cranford may be brought to Palmetto and burned at the stake." Du Bois had studied lynching in the US and knew that most often the supposed accusations were not accurate, and in his words, he, quote, thought that he might go down to the Atlanta Constitution and talk with Joel Chandler Harris and try to put before the South what happened in cases of this sort and try to see if I couldn't start some sort of movement. Unfortunately, before Du Bois could make it to the office of the editor, the mob had already found and murdered Sam Hose. Hose had been hiding in his mother's house near Macomb and had been apprehended by the mob. In front of a crowd of over 2,000 onlookers, Hose was chained to a tree, his ears sliced off, his fingers cut off one by one, his genitals sliced and thrown to the crowd before he was burned alive. The murder, pieces of his body were cut up. After the murder, pieces of his body were cut up and sold off as souvenirs of the event. It was while Du Bois was on his way to the office of the editor that he heard of the murder and was informed that the charred knuckles of Sam Hose were on display in a shop on the same street along which he was walking. At which point, he writes, "I then turned back to the university, and I began to turn aside from my work." The press coverage after the lynching of Hose made it clear how little the facts of the case would matter, even the law of Georgia did not matter when confronted with the irrationality of race hatred. Here's an example of an article after the killing of Sam Hose. It reads, "Sam Hose, the Negro who murdered Alfred Cranford and then ravished his wife, has paid the penalty of his crime. We will no doubt hear a great deal through the press in condemnation of the way in which the brute met his death. The northern press will howl and northern editors will tear their hair in impotent rage. That it was a violation of the law of Georgia to lynch Sam Hose, there is no doubt. But no man will seek to justify it from a legal standpoint. But there is an unwritten law that governs such cases, not only in Georgia, but throughout this country. Whenever a man commits a crime of rape and his identity is shown beyond a doubt, his trial has already been concluded without judge or jury. And be he white or black, the verdict is death. Such will be the only law that will govern such cases until that crime ceases to be committed." This highlights here the irrationality of lynching in the South. That it is against the law means nothing. They are following unwritten laws. That there is little or at time no evidence of any guilt means nothing. When one is accused, he is already deemed guilty. No mere observation of the facts of law or the facts of the incident will have an effect on what is emotionally, psychologically driven, such as the terrorist act of lynching. It is at this time that Du Bois begins to make his turn from science to propaganda. He writes, "Two considerations after the moment of Sam Hose broke upon my work and eventually disrupted it. First, one could not be a calm, cool, detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. Second," he says, "he regarded it as axiomatic that the world had wanted to learn the truth, and if the truth was sought, with even approximate accuracy and painstaking devotion, the world would gladly support the effort. This was, of course, but a young man's idealism, not by any means false, but also never universally true." At the same time that Du Bois was questioning his role as an academic and wishing for a more concerted and direct response to the injustices foisted upon the African American community of the day, he was finding himself more and more disappointed with community leadership, namely that of Booker T. Washington. Du Bois's desire for an organized political movement to combat the lynchings, Jim Crow laws, and increasing disenfranchisement ran opposite the plans of Washington and those at Tuskegee. Du Bois took a forceful stance against Booker T. Washington's policy of accommodation, calling instead for, quote, ceaseless agitation and insistent demand for equality, and, quote, the use of force of every sort, moral persuasion, propaganda, and where possible, even physical resistance. He was further aggravated by what he saw as a monopoly control of the African American press. He watched as one by one the leadership of local papers shifted to people affiliated with the Tuskegee Institute. Du Bois felt that without a press to call for agitation and protest, there could be no organized response to the injustices occurring. Du Bois was not alone in these thoughts, as some, particularly the younger generation, were opposed to Washington's methods. In 1901, two such men who opposed Tuskegee, Monroe Trotter from Harvard and George Forbes from Amherst College, began publishing the Boston Guardian. Du Bois wrote of the Guardian, quote, it was bitter, satirical, and personal, but it also was well-edited, earnest, and published facts. It attracted wide attention among colored people. It circulated among them all over the country. It was quoted and discussed. I did not wholly agree with the Guardian, and indeed, few Negroes did, but nearly all read it and were influenced by it. This inspired Du Bois, and he became convinced that a periodical was needed that was less radical than the Guardian, and yet free from the control of Tuskegee. He voiced this in a 1905 letter to Jacob Schiff, who he had turned to for support. And this letter from Jacob Schiff, from Du Bois to Schiff, I found in the archives, and then the response from Schiff, and then Du Bois again. So this is some of the archival work I was able to do while here at the W.E.B. Du Bois Library. It's a copy of the letter to make it easier to read. The key part states, I want to lay before you a plan which I have and ask you if it is of sufficient interest to you for you to be willing to hear more of it and possible to assist in its realization. The Negro race in America is today in a critical condition. Only a united, concerted effort will save us from being crushed. This union must come as a matter of education and long-continued effort. To this end, there is needed a high class of journal to circulate among the intelligent Negroes, to tell them of the deeds of themselves and their neighbors, interpret the news of the world to them, and inspire them toward definite ideals. Now, we have many small weekly papers and one or two monthlies, and none of them fill the greater need I have outlined. I want to establish, therefore, for the 9 million American Negroes and eventually for the whole Negro world, a monthly journal. And these 3 points, this outline that he says what this journal should be, is of significance to how impactful the crisis was. This is something I'll come back to later. Schiff responded with a letter that said, your plans to establish a high-class journal to circulate among the intelligent Negroes is in itself interesting and on its face has my sympathy. But before I could decide whether I can become of advantage in carrying your plan to effect, I would wish to advise with men whose opinion of such I consider of much value. Du Bois never heard back from Schiff, so he assumes that these friends who Schiff consulted with were in connection with the Tuskegee Institute and had ended the project before it started. Du Bois, however, although he did not hear back from Schiff, sent one final follow-up letter. Again, these are from the archives, in which he stated at the top, Dear Sir, I was of course much disappointed you did not see your way clear to help my magazine project. Nonetheless, Du Bois continued on with the project himself and included a few samples of the publication The Moon, which would eventually be a precursor to the crisis. Although, at the very bottom of the letter, you'll notice, he intends to say, you will of course realize that these samples are far below my ideal. They are the best possible on the present small capital. Still attempting to get this fundraising done. Now, although Schiff never came on board with the project, Du Bois continued on with it himself. He managed to publish The Moon for 1 year, from 1906 to 1907. The Moon would be a precursor to the crisis. But then, short of funds between 1907 and 1910, Du Bois ended The Moon, but still managed to publish a miniature monthly called The Horizon. And there are copies of The Horizon in this library that are excellent to look at. But after the founding of the NAACP, on August 1st, 1910, Du Bois finally embarked on his project with the crisis. Of this moment, he writes, "My career as a scientist was to be swallowed up as my role of master of propaganda." And we see the first publication was in November of 1910, and the magazine ran, and Du Bois continued on as the sole editor of it until 1933. The NAACP paid Du Bois' salary and part of the office expenses from 1910 to 1916, but from 1916 to 1933, the paper was self-supporting, and according to Du Bois, received and distributed over $500,000 and distributed 7.5 million copies. Which is a lot for the time, in case you don't know. It's very successful. And Du Bois is very proud of that. He wrote of it often. In the crisis, there was an editorial section on the important political matters of the day, according to Du Bois. There was an opinion section that would look at how important events were covered from the point of other newspapers, so kind of a critical assessment of the news. He selected topics that he thought his audience would appreciate, and he also thought would help build movement infrastructure, such as articles on women's clubs, on colored high schools, on the colored college athlete. A section called What to Read, which was often written by Jessie Fawcett, would give advice on selected books and articles. Biographies of prominent community members would be shown in Men of the Month. He included frequent bios on recent college graduates, many of whom were women. He encouraged Negro authors, poets, and artists in the crisis to publish their work. Everyone from Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Jean Toomer, County Cullen, Ann Spencer, Abraham Harris, and Jessie Fawcett. He provided not only biographical but visual representations of African Americans in the crisis. He writes of this, "I sought to encourage the graphic arts not only by magazine covers with Negro themes and faces, but as often as I could afford, I portrayed the faces and features of colored folk. One cannot realize today how rare it was in 1910. The colored papers carried few or no illustrations, the white papers none. In many great periodicals, it was the standing rule that no Negrite portrait was to appear." So this simple representation of identity that he was carrying out was actually quite radical for the time. And in this, he's trying to build a movement of identity both between individuals and between a community. And this was one of, I think, the things that made the crisis so very effective. I didn't have enough time to put it in this presentation, but in the archives I found lots of letters from librarians in different parts of the country saying how important this crisis was and ordering extra copies, saying that their copies sometimes would disappear, be stolen, that they'd circulate it around as many households as they could, and they needed even more to circulate. So the immediate impact of the crisis was very understood by the literate public. When Du Bois was writing in the crisis, in his editorials and in his opinion pieces, he often wrote to evoke emotion in his audience. It was a far step from his objective scientific writing. He would use sarcasm and humor. He would attack with acerbic wit and sardonic tone the hypocrisy that he saw in white churches. At one time writing, "How long is practical Christianity going to be able to survive its own hypocrisy? Or will Christian ministers even be able to keep straight faces while they preach?" This throws back to an earlier writing, Litany of Atlanta, in which he embodied the voice of a preacher and kind of, in order to call out the hypocrisy that churchgoers have, sitting there claiming to be followers of Christ, but then at the same time sitting idly by while people are lynched and murdered in their very own town. Again, in the case of lynchings, he tries to call upon the hypocrisy of Americans themselves in a very sardonic line where he says, "Let the eagle scream, let the eagle scream. America is redeemed at Coatesville. The last lyncher is acquitted, and the best traditions of Anglo-Saxon civilization are safe. Let the eagle scream." So he's trying to tie in patriotic and religious imagery to point out the hypocrisy of Americans who acted not in accord with the teachings of Christ or the promises of the Constitution. Du Bois, and this again is one of the reasons why I think his writing was so effective in getting through to the community of people, not just white, not just black, but also white. This is a form of media that I think is effective. Du Bois held his position as editor independently, and as such, he felt the magazine was a reflection of his ideas and his direction. He believed that he gave it life, he gave it color, and he thought that when an editorial board was consulted, ideas and opinions would become too watered down. Of this, he says, quote, "If the crisis had not been, in a sense, a personal organ and the expression of myself alone, it could not possibly have attained the popularity and effectiveness it did. It would have been the kind of dry organ that so many societies support." So he did think that having his own influence over the paper led it in the direction that it needed to go to, I think, agitate the way he thought the community should be agitated without having to get approval from anyone else. And indeed, The Crisis is arguably the most widely read and influential periodical about race and injustice that has ever been published in the US history, still published today. Du Bois himself also talked frankly about the success of the paper. He wrote, "I think I may say without boasting that in the period from 1910 to 1930, I was a main factor in revolutionizing the attitude of the American Negro caste. My stinging hammer blows made Negroes aware of themselves, confident of their possibilities, and determined in their self-assertion." And I posit that one of the reasons why The Crisis was in fact so influential is because it is indicative of the type of media that elicits strong effects and inspires people to democratic action. This is in contrast to the view that many political scientists hold that media has, quote, minimal effects. The minimal effects hypothesis from Clapper in 1960 holds that people's opinions are already formed and engagement with media does very little to change their ideas or actions. However, I argue against this hypothesis, and instead I posit that certain types of media can have very strong effects in inspiring democratic action and social movements. Again, to look at the particular type of media that does have strong effects is exactly the kind that Du Bois designed when he designed The Crisis. This is a look back at the letter that he sent that laid out his idea for the project. In it, remember, he had said, "There is a need of a high-class journal to circulate among intelligent Negroes to first, tell them of the deeds of themselves and their neighbors. Second, interpret the news of the world to them. And third, inspire them toward definite ideals." This is writing that in reflection of yourself and the other involves first in identity and community building, also in community cohesion. Second, the ideological interpretation of events and facts is very important, as opposed to what we would call traditional newspapers, or now we could call mainstream news, which simply presents the objective facts. And again, that's the kind of news Clapper was looking at when they came up with the minimal effects hypothesis. They were looking at, this was, research was done in the 50s, kind of looking at the main three networks, looking at a very objective kind of Walter Cronkite-esque presentation. And in that framing, facts do little to change people's opinions. However, if facts are presented from a particular ideological frame where the author, the writer, the podcaster, the radio host, whomever is interpreting those facts, interprets them within an ideological frame that explains to people what this fact means to you in your life, why is it important to you, and how it connects with your values, your ideals, and your individuality and role in your own community, then it can be very effective in shaping how people will then view those facts and then react to them. And then finally, the third, to inspire them toward definite ideals, making emotional appeals based on values and morals to people. This is the kind of salient appeal that I think actually causes a strong effect. Hearing a fact alone means nothing, but when that fact is then connected, or in some cases, when that lie is connected to an emotionally salient argument that connects to your heuristic processing, the way you immediately view yourself in the world based on your values and your moral understanding, this is what inspires people towards action. So, went off a little bit. And again, I'd say that these three aspects are very representative of the emotionally engaging form of argument that can have strong effects. We don't just see this example of Du Bois doing this on the left, where he moved from science to propaganda to incite a social movement, right? This can also happen on the right, very clearly, right? And I think an example that we're seeing today of this is through right-wing media. I think right-wing media, as it grew in the 90s, particularly after the 1996 Telecommunications Act, and established right-wing radio, Fox News, very editorialized blogs and reports such as the Drudge Report, Breitbart News. This type of media was engaging in these same three things that Du Bois was talking about. They engage in identity construction, they engage in community cohesion, they engage in an interpretation of the facts for its audience. An example of this, for example, would be a mainstream news source on the coronavirus would say, there's a coronavirus, it's an epidemic in the world, there are 3 cases in California, there are 5 cases in Rhode Island, there are more cases in Texas. This is something that we should be planning for, wait and see, right? That's the mainstream narrative. However, that fact, the fact of a virus in right-wing media, is framed through a different interpretation. It's framed that the coverage of the coronavirus is in fact a democratic hoax or a media plot to make President Trump look bad. So it's not about the virus, it's not about the virus being bad, it's about Trump's enemies using reports of the virus in order to belittle the president and to try to win political points upon him. So the framing of something as simple as a disease can be entirely different depending on how you're getting that information. Again, if you're getting that in the neutral, objective, mainstream fact reporting, it won't change things. But if you're getting it through this ideological interpretation, if the facts are interpreted ideologically for you, it could have very different results. And again, the results that it leads to, in the end, right-wing media is also very effective in telling people, like Du Bois would say, this is the organization you should join to do something about it. This is who you should vote for. Right? In the crisis, Du Bois would often say who should be voted for in what state, what organization should be joined, where you should send money if you can make political donations. These are the types of things that right-wing media also does. It says what you can do in relation to the events that it's reporting on. So when it reports a fact or event, it will relate it to what it means for you, what it means for your group, your in-group, what it means for your out-group, and then it connects it in an emotionally salient way to your values that you hold. And acting in defense of values, as we see with what Du Bois did in inciting, basically beginning the cohesion of a very strong social movement based around values, can happen on the left or it can happen on the right. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be around facts. Although Du Bois did this, he was a propagandist for the truth and did this based on facts. You can have propaganda that is not based on facts, right? And so this type of right-wing media has proved very revolutionary. It has, I think, inspired the Tea Party that helped shift the Republican Party further to the right and aided in the election of Donald Trump. Again, the interesting point about this particular right-wing social movement as it contrasts with Du Bois is that in right-wing propaganda, often the facts are not accurate, they do not have correct information, but this matters very little because the emotional appeal is still salient. And this is why when people on the left try to counteract these right-wing narratives by pointing out the facts and telling them that their information is correct, often they just shrug and say, I don't care, right? This has very little effect on their beliefs. Because you cannot fight an emotional ideological battle with objective rationality alone. you need to place those facts within an emotional appeal that also targets people's higher ideals. Also points out, for example, the hypocrisy with Christianity or the Constitution that Du Bois does, connects it to who you identify yourself as based on your morals and your ideology. And so I would say that if the left wants to effectively counteract right-wing propaganda and form more impactful social movements, they're going to need to take a page from Du Bois's book and become propagandists for the truth. Okay.
So now we open it up for questions.
Yeah, have some question time.
I have a question.
Oh, sure.
So when we watch the mainstream media, right, or corporate media, I feel like I guess CNN and MSNBC would be considered mainstream or left.
CNN is considered mainstream. MSNBC is considered to be left, but it doesn't operate the same way that right-wing media does still. Yeah.
So I think about, or progressive radio. I still think that
Doesn't exist.
I'm asking how, because I feel like when I'm watching like Don Lemon go on and on for 10 minutes, I feel like it's an emotional appeal about why this particular fact is affecting. Like I feel like that is what he's trying to do. Or if I hear, I would say, a monologue by Rachel Maddow, it's, first of all, you have to have a degree sometimes to break down what she's saying. But do you see those as trying to counter? Because I see those as this, but it's not necessarily touted as their opinion, but it is their opinion as they're not anchors in the Walter Cronkite way. They're going on and on about, and I think it's their opinion, or they're writing it. I'm trying to figure out how is that what you are considered kind of the counter to right-wing media, or it operates very differently?
I'd say that it's similar. Yeah, I think that there are examples. I mean, of course, on MSNBC, you're going to get a problem with the fact that it's still, in a sense, a corporate media, right? So that's why you don't get very much coverage of Bernie or Warren. That's why, for example, when they were having the debate over net neutrality, there was almost no coverage, because that is anathema to their corporate interests, right? The owners of the corporation don't want that. Another problem would be, for example, with Social Security. Even when on the left wing, on MSNBC, when they talk about Social Security, they often don't talk about lifting the cap and what that would do, because again, it's against the interests of the owners. So part of it is that you need the money, the corporate issue, to be taken out of it to make it more effective. But the other thing is just the balance, right? So when we say things like MSNBC, there's one station, right? And it supposedly is in contrast to Fox, but what's happened is that there is an entire right-wing media ecosystem that has occurred and grown up. And so it's not just that they're doing it differently, it's that they've been doing it longer. They started this very concertedly in the 90s. Right-wing radio is absolutely huge, right? And this is something I'd be happy to talk more about. More questions, or if people want to talk about it tomorrow, this is kind of what I tend to do my work on. So Sean Hannity, right? You see him on Fox. Sean Hannity, the entire time he's had his show on Fox, he has also had his 3-hour radio program every single day. And do you know why? Because his radio program has 4 times more listeners than his show on Fox, right? So right now we're in a state where Rush Limbaugh has 10 times more listeners than the New York Times has readers, right? And this is something that's very important because radio it's considered the invisible medium, the hidden medium, because you can't see it. So everybody really started talking about this when Fox came on, because people could look at Fox and say, oh, I see this thing, therefore I know it's happening. But in the meantime, this had been happening with the takeover of radio, which radio is incredibly impactful. In fact, out of a political scientist, Fau, did studies on how you can best elicit, again, democratic action, change people's opinions, get them to go vote, get them to participate, right? And he looked at every form of media and how it could do it. And in every form of interaction, really. And he found that there were only two things that could actually elicit democratic action. The very first thing was a person-to-person conversation. You talk to your neighbor in person, and you convince them of something, or you ask them to go vote, or you say why they should. The second was talk radio. Nothing else even came close, right? And that's because talk radio is incredibly salient. The way it operates is it's a person talking to you. They're in your ear, right? You're while you're driving, while you're working, while you're doing something. And in that way, it's a one-on-one conversation. When you have the TV, you look at the TV and it's mediated. You know that those people are in another room talking to other people, not you. But when that person is in your ear talking to you, they're talking directly to you, right? That's why Rush Limbaugh always says, my friends, my friends. He calls people his friends. There's an incredible amount of community building within right-wing radio. They have a language of their own, a discourse of their own, there are inside jokes. And also, it's the length of the format, right? Mm-hmm. You have to understand that when you watch, Rachel Maddow for an hour, that's great. But Rush Limbaugh's on for 3 hours, right. Yeah. And so is Sean Hannity, and so is Michael Savage, and so is the entire lineup of that show, of that network. And I'd posit that one of the big problems we're having here, again, is that, social media, particularly right-wing radio, it has that thing where it's the host's opinion, right? Like when Du Bois says, this was my opinion and my ideas, that's how I could craft it, that is important, right? And these hosts, Rush Limbaugh, it's his message. Michael Savage, it's his. Laura Ingraham, it's hers. They have the message, they have the interaction with the audience, they have the trust built in from their audience members. And in that, they build an identity with the audience as being a community. And once you feel like you're part of a team, that's also what brings people to the table in terms of politics. Another reason why it's so effective. And then again, the framing. When you talk to people who listen to right-wing radio, it's not often that they don't know the news, they don't know the facts. They might have heard it, but they just have a totally different interpretation of it. So they'll know there's 5 cases of coronavirus in California, but they'll think it's a Democratic hoax, right? They'll think that it's been being used as a political tool. They won't say it's just not happening. So that framing of information is extra important, and then that framing of in-group versus out-group, and saying why you should care, and that emotionally salient thing, and connecting to people on a personal level, which again, I think Du Bois was doing this identity building when he would show pictures of people, he would do biographies of people, he would say you can see them in yourself. That's what happens when right-wing radio callers call in, right? And the listener can hear somebody like themselves engaging with the host. So I do think that right-wing radio particularly is like a par excellence of this type of propaganda and this type of media that will elicit activities. And then the problem again is that it is 95% right-wing radio, right? So when the Telecommunications Act started, first was passed in 1996 by Clinton, and it lifted how many stations could be owned. People think that radio has always been right-wing. It wasn't. It was a pretty much a 50-50 split back in the early 90s. There were about a third of the hosts were liberal, about a third of the hosts were conservative, and about a third of the hosts were very middle of the road independents. And this was all over the country because they were local radio stations who dealt with local news and local people. So it's part of the thing that kept the polarization from spiking. The nationalization of our media has allowed this polarization to spike because in 1996, before 1996, a company could only own 40 radio stations. That was it. So Clear Channel owned 40 radio stations, right? After 1996, 2 years after the passage of the Telecommunications Act, Clear Channel owned over 2,000 radio stations. And what they then did, and then people think that right-wing radio was a demand issue. But I argue that it was not a demand issue, it was actually a supply issue. People liked their local hosts, but when Clear Channel buys your station, they fire the local talent, and that's an economic issue. Why do you want to pay more hosts, right? It's cutting into your bottom line. And you end up, again, technology played into this, you end up syndicating your big host. And who's the biggest host? Rush Limbaugh. Okay, then who do you play with Rush Limbaugh? Again, at the same time, the Fairness Doctrine was removed in the 1980s as well, or stopped being enforced under Ronald Reagan. The Fairness Doctrine said that you had to have a balance of opinion on radio. And again, all these laws were passed because in the 1920s and 30s, they knew how effective radio was, right? When you had Father Coughlin leading, this rise of semi-fascism in the US, people knew radio was powerful. So they put these laws on it. But as we slowly deregulate, the market gets monopolized, and then due to the economic incentive of the monopolization, that's why all the hosts become syndicated, and when the most popular hosts are right-wing hosts, that's who you get. And then it gets to a point where then the audience of that channel doesn't want to hear something else, and they'll call up and complain about the host, and then if the host isn't carrying water, they'll get fired. We actually heard that's something that happened very recently. It's happening in the Trump age, because there are some right-wing media, right-wing radio hosts who were what we would call traditional Republicans, what others would call never-Trumpers, and when they speak about Trump, they can get fired from their networks, removed from their networks. So that's to say that at this point now, there is not one corner of America you can go to and not hear Rush Limbaugh. You can hear him everywhere, right? And meanwhile, there are only 20 progressive radio stations in the country. That's it, 20 in the entire country. Right? And so when the interpretation of the fact, and let's also, put one more thing, and I'll stop on this question. It was a great question. One more thing in that.
Great.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. That when, well, let's look at the average demographic audience for right-wing radio. The average right-wing radio listener is a white, average age 55-year-old, blue-collar male. Right? This is exactly the demographic that the Democrats are complaining they lost. And well, why did you lose this demographic? Why did you lose white, working class, blue collar, 55-year-old males? Well, because you stopped talking to them in 1996. In 1996, you stopped talking to them, right? Because that's the main demographic for right-wing radio. So when suddenly you get your news of the day shifts and you get your news presented to you from Rush Limbaugh instead of someone else, and you hear that for 30 years, your opinions slowly start to change. And so that's how we can end up having people who are in unions voting against the Democrats. Again, that seems totally irrational, right? That's part of this, why don't facts matter in politics? How could you be in a union and then vote against the party that was supporting you, maybe not so well, but vote for the party who's been actively trying to destroy you? Because the way that has been presented to you is not the case. Right? The way it's been presented to you, there are other factors that might rise above that importance. And so I think exactly that is part of the reason. So when I call on the left to be propagandists for the truth, part of this is investing in this infrastructure. The left wing needs to invest in progressive infrastructure, progressive media infrastructure that isn't CNN, it isn't neutral, it's more than MSNBC, and you can get it in more places. And that's what they should really be starting to do if they want to combat this, because it's just going to continue. And it isn't properly met with the corporate mainstream media. No.
I know Blake had her hand up, but I just wanted to finish up with the long question. But there was on MSNBC last night, there was this guy, his last name is Poof. Mm-hmm. So he's got this new book called The Citizen's Guide to Beating Donald Trump. And it's about how we need to step, and it's not this exact thesis, but what he was saying was he was talking about social media. He was like, we need, if Bloomberg is going to throw his support, we need to use Bloomberg tactics for the Democratic Party because the right wing has it, or Trump has it. And he was like, we are so blind thinking that it's just one way to do it, but we have to actually catch up because Trump has been extremely effective in all of these other ways, including radio, social media, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought that was interesting because he was like, basically like, come on people, like.
Exactly. I mean, Trump knows where he got his base and where he got his supporters. I mean, the thing is that this is also why so many of the mainstream press, the elite academics, the elite politicians didn't see Trump coming, because when he showed up and he said things that were so clearly inaccurate, right? He was saying things that were just untrue. He was lying continuously. He didn't know what he was talking about. He was misrepresenting things. He was speaking in, these bombastic racialized tones, and everybody said, like, this isn't going to fly. But if you were listening to right-wing radio, you'd realize he was saying exactly what that audience is hearing all of the time, right? And that audience is about the size of the primary voters of the Republican Party, right? So they're the ones hearing this. So that's why when Trump started speaking, although the elite press and academics and politicians who don't attune to right-wing radio, well, they looked at him and said, this is crazy, right? Other people heard that. Those primary voters who are the most attuned to politics said, he's speaking the God's truth. Like, he's telling the truth like no one has ever told it, right? And that's why they see him as a truth teller. because he's repeating these right-wing radio narratives. And he knows this. I mean, the day after he was elected, he called Michael Savage to thank him, right?
Yeah.
He called Alex Jones to thank him, right? Rush Limbaugh receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Trump is maybe the most honest thing Trump's ever done, right? I mean, like, Rush Limbaugh did get him elected. He would not have been elected if not for the Telecommunications Act of 1996. I do not think so, and the shift we had in media.
Which is why a lot of people who are voting for Trump don't exactly know how to explain it.
Yeah.
They're just going to do it because they know it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
You talk to some of them, it's like you sit there and you think you're in an alternate universe, but it's real.
It's real to them.
It's real.
Yeah. And again, that's why you need this, and that isn't affected by just this reportage of the facts, right? Again, the left's problem, and I think this is why Du Bois was so compelling in his shift, the left seems to think that the facts speak for themselves. And the facts don't speak for themselves, right? The facts need to be argued for, and they need to be argued for persuasively and emotionally and with connections to ideals and values that will actually get people to care, right? Or otherwise it's just a fact and it doesn't affect your life. You need to explain how it affects your life. And that's what they need to be doing too, to be calling in more people when they talk about getting people involved in politics. Most people walk around not knowing how it actually affects them, right? Until you actually sit down and explain it. And then again, when you interpret the news for them, then it actually brings people to the table. Any other questions?
I don't know, it's related to this, it's maybe going to throw a wrench in this, or at least make a depressing situation worse.
Oh, great.
Which is my question, thinking about, right, is this, not only is there this legacy of, say, left-wing media or propaganda on the side of truth being behind in terms of its production and its volume and people who pay attention to it and the money pouring in, et cetera. But I'm curious, particularly with the new phrase of fake news, is that it's not this dichotomy of taking facts and making them personal in a certain way, spinning them for the left, taking facts and making them personal and spinning them in a certain way by the right. It's actually this problem, that I feel like there's a difference between using art and language to make a story that connects people to the truth, or using art and language to tell a story that breaks the notion of facts and truth. That is literally breaking language, right? And that has become the method of the right because facts and truth do no longer support their message and the point of view that they would love. And so what happened, it's not equal sides.
Right.
Does that question sort of make sense?
Oh, yeah,
one group is
absolutely.
trying to take reality and have discourse, and they're not doing a great job. They should be making it more personal and emotional and doing all these things that you're arguing and tying it to image and art and all these things that humans crave and love and remember. But the other side is not trying to do that.
Right.
They are trying to break language so that reality is muddied for all. And I feel like the notion of fake news is really representative of that, of their project being to break truth.
Yeah, I mean, it is, right? Because when you don't have the facts on your side, what do? You make the facts contestable. And this isn't, again, this is something that, the left was not fighting back hard enough, not with a loud enough megaphone, and they weren't taking it seriously enough, right? I mean, even when I was writing my dissertation, I had a very difficult time because I was writing on this and my advisor was saying, why are you focusing on this fringe minority, this, this crazy radical fringe of the party? And I was saying, this is the party, right? And then when Trump was elected, he was like, oh, yeah, okay. Guess you were right. But, we didn't take it very seriously. In the mid-90s, there was a lot of attention from political communications scholars who looked at Rush Limbaugh and looked at this rise of radio, and they looked at it with a lot of fervor for a few years, and then it kind of died off, right? People stopped paying attention to it. But it didn't stop being popular. It hasn't stopped in its popularity continuously. And if you need to know the popularity of that type of medium, just look at the rise of podcasts. People are acting like, oh, podcasts came out of nowhere. I mean, radio still gets, again, like I'm saying, Hannity show has more listeners than it has viewers, right? It is wildly popular because it's so accessible. And the radio is free, right? You need, for a podcast, you need a smartphone. So it's also, there's access. But to talk more to your point, that was also an intentional strategy on the part of the right. So when you know the facts aren't on your side, you destroy the facts. And it actually, a really good book to look to this is Merchants of Doubt, that was written by two scholars from Harvard, and it looks at climate change. and it looks at how this was a concerted effort that was funded by oil money. Yeah. And what they did was they hired the same advertisers who had helped from Madison Avenue, who had helped cigarette producers deny that cigarettes were causing cancer, and they applied that same method to the denial of climate science, right? And so the point isn't to say, oh, the planet's warming, no it isn't. You can't say that, but you can say, well it is, but we don't know that it's carbon dioxide. Well it is, but we don't know. All you have to do is, again, bring doubt. That's why they're called merchants of doubt. And unfortunately, that's something that the right-wing media has been doing very effectively and systematically against the mainstream media, which is what's putting us in this position, because the number one talking point for 30 years for Rush Limbaugh has been a critique of the liberal media, right? Mm-hmm. So the more they call it, and this is every single right-wing host across the board and Fox News. They don't cover things other than criticizing the liberal media. Like that's 90% of their content. It's amazing. Which scholars, which some political scientists often don't understand. I remember reading this study where they were looking at, our channel's biased, right? And so they looked at CNN and how many Republicans versus Democrats they brought on, or they talked about, or they mentioned, and they looked at Fox News and how many Republicans versus Democrats they mentioned. And they mentioned more Democrats on Fox News, but it's because they were critiquing them the entire time, right? So that doesn't say that it's supportive of the Democratic Party. They were always the point of ridicule. And so, to get back to that point, when you say things like this, like the media has a liberal bias, over and over again enough, it starts to convince people of that. And there are many studies that show that the more you repeat this, the more people believe it. And so they've been repeating it consistently for 30 years. And so it's gotten this point where the right-wing media could say something, and then the mainstream media could say, like, that's actually not accurate. And then they say, well, that's just your bias, right? Because you have a left-wing bias. So suddenly it destroys facts, and it puts everything into the realm of opinion. This is your opinion, and this is my opinion. And that is incredibly destructive. And again, it's incredibly useful, right? Because when everything is devolved to the point of opinion, people don't even know how to fight for the truth. And a point I bring up here is, for example, the problem that they're having with Facebook not cracking down on right-wing sites. Well, they've done this because, again, the right-wing media, what they do is they bully people, right? And so the mainstream media, the left-wing media, social media are terrified of the right wing. They're terrified of being called biased, right? This is why on the Sunday morning shows, there are always more Republicans than Democrats, always. Republicans get more coverage because they don't want to be called biased. They don't want to say they have a left-wing bias. So they assuage their demands, and they give airtime to people who shouldn't be having airtime, right? To things that aren't actual news, that shouldn't be heard. And that's happening in the mainstream press, and it's happening on Facebook. So, for example, among Facebook's group of fact-checking sites is the Daily Caller and the Drudge Report. Like those are right-wing propaganda tools, right? But they have them as part of their fact-checkers because they don't want to look biased. So that's why we're in this and when they shut down a right-wing site because they say that's not true, and then the right wing says, well, now that's just your left-wing bias, then they stop doing it. So this argument that everything is opinion has been wildly effective, to the point where, like, guardians of the truth no longer know where to stand. Or let me say, merchants of Facebook don't know where to stand, right? Because they don't want to upset their consumer base. But yeah.
So I just, maybe to piggyback off that a little bit, so I teach a course on the history of conspiracy theories.
Oh, awesome.
And one of the challenges, and so it's terrifyingly relevant, but so I die a little bit every time a student in like my world history class says, oh, have you seen Ancient Aliens?
Yeah.
Ancient Aliens, which is a bunch of conspiracy theories, you know, right? And, but here's the fundamental problem, I guess, if the left is supposed to, if the other side is not starting from that first point you had up there, science and objective facts and so on,
right,
then it's actually harder to make that emotional appeal you're talking about, because, so for example, if you look at the idea that aliens built Stonehenge, it's like, actually there's a pretty simple way to show that's not true. You simply look at the thousands of years of history of the evolution of the site, and then you say to students, do you really think they came and like put little wood posts in, and then 1,000 years later the aliens came back and they made it more complex? But the thing is, that takes time,
Mm-hmm.
and it's complicated and nuanced, and it's not like nearly as fun as like the aliens came and they put those things down and they danced, it's like, so that's, to me, I don't know if that's kind of partly what you're saying, like that's the problem, is that like we can talk about this countering that, but how do you can't counter that unless you divorce yourself from the truth, I don't know.
Well, I mean, I don't know that you have to divorce yourself from the truth, because like you said, you point out all the different things that happened, but I think it's a way of pointing it out in a way that cuts to the core quicker, So, like I said, for example, in Litany of Atlanta with Du Bois, when he writes, as a preacher basically doing this call and response in church, it's a way, because it makes you, heuristically feel that you are in church, it brings you into that emotional state, into that salient moment, and then the truth of it rings true, right? Then when you talk about lynching in that moment, you're like, oh, this is actually conflicting with my values. So it's finding ways that cut to the heart of it quicker. I could picture somebody maybe perhaps with like explaining very sarcastically how, did the aliens show up at this time, and then this time, and then this time, and then this time, and when you actually build that eventually and just kind of like point out the how ridiculous it is, that can work too, but it needs to be done in a way where you're not just saying, no, you're wrong, it's stupid. It has to be in an it has to be entertaining, it has to be something that grips your attention, and it has to be something where like there is an outcome at the end, where like, well, if you believe that, there's then there's something wrong with you, or so, like there has to be something in the end, or else you end up in the people, there's something that's shown how often, what the left has is comedy, but comedy sometimes doesn't really work because people like irony themselves into not caring anymore, right? It's irony into indifference is what it is. So when the end result is like, oh, everybody's just stupid, oh, politics are just dumb, all the politicians are wrong, right? Which you used to get in the Daily Show, at least when like Jon Stewart was doing it, which is why it wasn't like super effective. It's different with Trevor Noah now, because he's saying like, no, there's definitely something wrong with like one side. This problem is not being reflected. You kind of have to point that out. In more accurate ways, but yeah, I mean, it's a hard problem. It's that, and that's why conspiracy theories fly around faster on the internet too. I mean, and that's one of the bigger problems. Unfortunately, like I don't think that the internet conspiracy theories that fly around so quickly are going to be as devastating to reality as the 30 years of constructively built ideological framing that like Rightwing Law did, right? Because when you've been listening to him for 30 years, like you get the information and you turn it around in your own head, like you create your own frame for it. And that long 3-hour discussion like adds to it. But again, if we had Left-Wing Radio and we had a long 3-hour discussion to talk about how the aliens didn't build Stonehenge, like that would be it too, right? But that costs money. That maybe Bloomberg should be giving us, or Tom Steyer, I mean, Tom Steyer he's a frequent guest on one of the few progressive radio shows, Stephanie Miller's show, and it's funny because every time he gets on, she's like, no, it's great, I think it's great that you're trying to impeach Trump, and as soon as he goes away, he's like, and why won't you build a progressive media network? Why are you spending all your money on this? Like, if you really want a country, like, to change the country, do that, like, support progressive media, because again, they don't have the support, right? And I think, just to kind of end on that, like one of the bigger problems with that is because billionaires on the left in America, they have a lot of places they want to put their money, like Bill Gates, right? If you're someone with a good heart in America, you can, build a well in Africa. You can cure diseases in other countries. You can build schools, for young girls. You care about doing that, so you have other places to put your money that aren't so controversial. If you're on the right, you care about having political power in America. So you put all your money there. Right. Like that's where all your money goes, right? You're worried about the ideological battle here, right? The Koch brothers, exactly. Yeah. So that's another problem, is that we might have money on the left, but it's not being spent here politically, unfortunately.
Okay, so I know. Do you have a question?
No, it's just we ended on such a depressing.
Oh.
Another question. It might give people opportunity to be less depressing.
Okay,
sure.
It's for the academics in the room, of which I know there's at least one or a couple. Which is, what do you do with this scenario, right, where I'm assuming at least some of your production is teaching students in an academic setting, is giving talks in academic settings, is writing things for academics. What do we do with this lesson of not that those things don't matter, but like, maybe they don't matter? And like, how do you get your own message as academics beyond the ivory tower? How do we deal with this idea that Du Bois had to leave the academy to make the impact he was hoping to make?
Well, I mean, I teach at a community college and I'm a philosophy professor. So in some ways, it's a small ivory tower. So a lot of times, I do work with students that a lot of times they're heavily influenced, North Central Massachusetts, by parents that listen to these shows. And we talk about truth, we talk quite a bit about language and how language functions. But I guess my primary concern is that the course of education is changing so much that many of my students might have one class with someone who talks about these things. And largely because of the cost of higher education, because of the fact that, especially in community college, things are being aimed towards job creation, that the exposure to discourse outside of the mainstream media, is very, very limited. In the social spaces, the dialogue within these social spaces are quite a bit limited too. So I think I have a very deep fear. Yeah.
I think that there are outlets, right, to reach outside the academy. I mean, I feel like the classroom is like the front line for activism. Like, I don't need to march anywhere. I'm good. I like march every day in the classroom. But you know, there's levels to it, and a lot of times students say, I've never heard this aspect of this. And so, but I mix humor with it. You know, because we have a population and a generation that has to be entertained, because they're so used to turning on and turning off whenever they want. In terms of social media, that sounded weird, but you know, in terms of access, right? And so I think sometimes they go into a classroom expecting the same kind of, like I know that at Wesleyan, a friend of mine was saying that it's good money, but they have these, what they call binge courses, where you take like the whole semester in like a winter session, but they call it binge to relate to binging on Netflix.
Oh,
like,
that's so funny. Wow.
Can we not
Yeah.
do that?
Well, the problem you're going to have, as you were talking about to me the other day, is that, you know, I was teaching a feminist course in high school, which was enough of a whatever. But anyway, I literally got to the point where I had to sit down with the students, brilliant students, getting 4s and 5s on AP tests, and read with them, because social media was taking that ability to read and interpret. And these are kids who are not necessarily listening to Rush Limbaugh, but the other side is, what are you getting out of this? Well, have you actually read it? You read it, you skimmed it, okay. While you were doing your Facebook page, and you have to literally read, and that's sad that you have to read with them in order to get that interpretation. But those are the things that are going to have to happen.
We've been reading out loud.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
And it's amazing the effect that it has when each student is reading a different thing, and then you stop and go, what does this mean? And then you actually engage. But it's like, so we assign less, and we have to explain more.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing they're so unfamiliar with, is actually reading so carefully, so critically, and then you have to go back and read a page more than once. I mean, that's something they don't get anywhere. A lot of the time.
Yeah, they don't, and social media unfortunately erodes that, right? Tweets, the fact that we're tweeting now, as you started this talk with, we'll end up tweeting our foreign policy is not a great idea. But you know, again, I'd say that this would be the same kind of, we need propaganda for the truth, propaganda for knowledge, and we need a values-based thing, something to incite people to ideals, like Du Bois had said, and these ideals, these values need to be things like valuing critical thinking. We need to put that back in our educational structure. Valuing democratic education, right? Civics, Andrea would talk about a lot. We need to put civics back, right? People need to think that civics is a value. They need to think that coming to the table and being engaged politically has value. They need to think that sitting down and, maybe we need to call it deep reading, right? Like deep thinking, like that has value. And we need that supported in our infrastructure and our policies, right? Our school systems need to do that. We need to teach media literacy. And hopefully if we can, at least we all decide that these are values we want to see reflected in our policy and school systems, maybe we can, like Du Bois, fight for that to happen.
I just have one question back to his years with the crisis. And I'm just wondering about feedback, since we're talking about dialogue, we're talking about conversations back and forth. Is there content of letters to the editor from readers?
Yes.
Just give. Did they come into different categories, or how would you look at those?
There were different pages that would have different letters to the editor where they would bring up something that happened in different issues. It got very similar to, I don't know how to qualify them, but
mostly in agreement with what he's saying, and
yeah, mostly in agreement. He had. I mean, there were things that he said that were not people didn't agree with, and he would often give voices to alternative opinions. He might even write it in his own editing. Like, someone approached me about this and said that this was not, that I had said something. This is not the way to go about it. And then he'd say, but here's what I think, right? So, and I think that's goes back to his time in the academy. I think he was. Often happy to engage with differences of opinion and then, see why his was right. Or oftentimes, over his life, he changed his mind many times. It was many academics are not as willing to admit they may have been wrong about something as Du Bois was. But again, I think it's because he was a pragmatist. But I'd say that even more interesting were the personal letters to him about how the crisis affected people's lives that I found in the archives, which were beautiful. There's this one letter from L.L. Vale, who was a librarian, and she mentions that thanks Du Bois for representing what she calls the new Negro, and that people needed to see this representation because in the movies they're only represented as criminals or brutes or only put in prison, and the white press completely ignores them, and how without this white America also will not understand how to interpret African Americans in this new day of freedom. And she says, and thanks him for that. And there's many letters like that, thanking him for that. A lot of letters thanking him for the Brownies, which was a small edition that was a children's book for African American children of the time, or all children. It was and for any children. They made that very clear. But that was really impactful. People don't give that as much credence to. And I guess I'd say that in that Du Bois, he moved from saying that he thought racism was a problem of ignorance to thinking that it was a problem of cruelty. And then in the end, he ends on this very kind of what I call like a postmodern note, and says, I had to go back to psychology, and now I have realized that the problem of racism is far more ingrained in habits, folkways, and customs. So at this point, he's talking about discourse, right? And he says that's what you need to change. And the way that you change discourse, like discursive understandings, how we understand things, intergenerational and multi-pronged, right? You need it in every level. You need it in children's books, you need it in schools, you need it in media, you need to reconceive the customs and habits of culture to actually achieve that change. And in the end, that's what he decided needed to happen, but he was also confident that it would happen. So I think that's
in fact, it has happened with social media.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
So thank you all for staying. And